Thanks very much, Claire. It's really great to be with you guys. It is a bit of a complex discussion to be having, especially at 7 o'clock in the morning or whatever time it is here right now. It's great to be with you, and I think also, Claire, just to say that I think one of the primary reasons this issue is still on the agenda and it's still being debated in such a constructive way is thanks in no small part to your own work. I wanted to make a few preliminary remarks about what I see as some of the challenges and problems and what's at stake, and then just to set out a little bit of empirical data to illustrate the points. Is this, do I control the PowerPoint from here or is someone doing it from there?
We do. We have it here. So if you sort of wave your hand or something when you want us to change the slide.
Okay, great. So, so that's what we're talking about. So if we can move to the next one. So just, I mean, this is just to stand back a little bit, and maybe as someone who hasn't been as involved in a lot of you in the immediate post-2015 debate. I mean, it strikes me that there are some pretty fundamental reasons why equity should be right at the heart of this agenda. And some of those reasons, I think, are rooted in a human development approach and a social justice approach, which is, first of all, I think we're living in a world where we are beyond what could be considered acceptable disparities, both at a global level and nationally. The rise in inequality across countries, I think, is a fundamental social justice issue. The idea that we need to equalize opportunities, or what's then we call capability, I think is a fundamental human development imperative. It's something that we ought to be doing in and of itself because it's intrinsically important. But I think also, and I'll come back to this point, that inequality is at the heart of the shortfalls in what we've achieved under the MDGs. The inequality, in my view, has been a brake on progress across all of the goals, well, at least across the goals that we can quantify. I think also that bringing equity into the goals can help turn the policy spotlight on things that matter, and in particular on the central point that reaching people at the margins of society, the most vulnerable, poses different types of policy challenges than it does for the average person. In other words, making progress at the margins is not a matter of reproducing what we're doing on average. There are additional interventions that are required. And I think, lastly, we need to recognize that inequality has become one of the defining political mobilization causes of our time. And just as someone who used to work in the UN, and someone who's been a little bit involved in this dialogue from the outside, it often strikes me that these debates often dissolve into sort of very technocratic discussions and bureaucratic processes. But out there and across all of the countries that we work in, there are social movements who are mobilizing around this issue. And I think tapping into their energy and ambition and creativity is absolutely fundamental to making the MDG project mean something and to deliver something. Can we go to the next slide? So all of that said, there are some pretty big challenges, and I think those challenges often appear as undercurrents in the debates that we have, and maybe including the debate today. So first of all, I think there's a general consensus that this thing called inequality is important, but there's a lot of divergence on exactly what types of inequality matter. A distinction that was drawn in the World Development Report a few years ago on equity was between this idea of equality of opportunity on the one side, by which they were principally talking about education and health opportunities, versus consumption or expenditure inequality on the other. The issue of whether we should be focusing on group-based inequalities or individual disparities. And I think someone like Amartya would probably be more towards the individual end of the spectrum. Other people would take more of a sort of group-based perspective. Whether we should be focused on wealth-based disparities in relation to wider goals like in education and health, or whether we should be focusing on the distribution of outcomes in relation to the goals themselves. The bottom 20% of the education distribution as distinct from the bottom 20% of the wealth distribution. And those things overlap, but the correlation isn't one. There's another undercurrent, which I think has surfaced in some of the recent debates with people like Stefan Clausen, Martin Rebellion and Adam Wagstaff at the bank, which is this, I guess is a pretty fundamental question, that if you set an absolute goal, the eradication of poverty, the elimination of unnecessary child deaths, why do disparities matter? Tony Blair once famously said, do I need to reduce David Beckham's income in order to make the poor happier? Well, that was a pretty crass way of making the point. But I think it does point to this question of that, if we have a framework which focuses on the absolutes, do we really need to worry about the relative side of the equation? There are divergences over what we mean by equity. The World Bank has somehow contrived a definition to reducing inequality, which involves monitoring the income growth of the bottom 40%. This is set out in the paper that's going to the board at the spring meeting here. I mean, that approach actually has nothing to do with inequality at all, but it's somehow permeated down into the debate on the MDGs. Whereas groups like Oxfam and Save the Children have adopted a much more overtly redistributive approach to inequality. And then we have a bunch of measurement and metric issues. I often think, maybe because of the politics of the exercise, that we're not maybe as upfront as we should be about how little we know. That, if you look at the data on inequality in Africa, I mean, frankly, we don't have the faintest idea about most trends for most countries. We have a few data points here and there, and we have this approach which is based on these big clunking surveys, living standard measurement surveys, or DHS, which happen every 5 years, and we don't have the sort of nimble tools that we need to give us a real-time picture of what's going on. Can we go to the next slide? So what are some of the reasons that, I mean, personally, I think equity should be right at the heart of the agenda? Well, first of all, because I think it's indisputable that income disparities and the rise in income disparities, especially in Africa, but also in other regions, are demonstrably slowing progress towards the poverty reduction goals. So if we want to hit the absolute targets for poverty reduction, we need to get serious about the distribution of increments to growth. If you take some of the individual sectors, progress in education has basically stalled since about 2005. To my mind, there's very clear evidence that the stalling is a direct consequence of the failure of governments to target their most marginalized and most vulnerable children. I'll come back to some of these points of care in a moment. I think we have the same thing going on in health, and I'll show some recent data on that if I have time in a moment, where in some countries, in general, child mortality, for example, as an indicator, is coming down. But in some countries, it's coming down far more dramatically in the richest quintile of society than in the bottom quintile. And since it's in the bottom quintile that most child deaths happen, that's actually the inverse of what we need from an MDG acceleration point of view. One of the things I think we need to be very careful of in this debate is about treating inequality in different silos. And I think Nyla has made this point really powerfully in a lot of her work, that what really matters is the way in which these different types of inequality intersect with each other and produce multiplier effects. The way that gender intersects with wealth-based disparities, with disadvantages related to ethnicity, and so on. And I'll come back to that again in a moment. I think we also have to recognise that the reason for putting inequality on the agenda is that we're trying to send the MDGs are really about sending some pretty basic signals to government and establishing a framework that we can mobilise around in civil society and contribute to as researchers. And what we're trying to do here is to turn the spotlight on the simple fact that if governments want to accelerate progress, you need to think far more about how you deliver basic services and opportunities at the lower end of the distribution. Reaching the last 10% of kids who are out of school is not the same as reaching the 30th percentile. And I'll come back to that in a moment. There's a final point that I wanted to make, and maybe we can go into more on discussion, is that I think we have to recognize that the factors that are perpetuating extreme disparities are self-reproducing, and they're self-reproducing through policy. Extreme inequalities produce bad policies in general, but they also produce policies that are bad for poverty reduction. Just as a very stark example, if you take a country like Pakistan, it desperately needs to increase revenue collection in order to put in place basic health and a basic education system. It's not in a position to do that because it has one of the world's lowest revenue to GDP ratios, and that's in large measure because the country has a tax code written by the rich for the rich in order to facilitate tax evasion. And it's an example, I think, of how inequality permeates down into the fabric of society and into the political process. So just to go to the more empirical part. So can we go to the next slide? This is just to set out why distribution matters for poverty reduction, and it's making a blindingly obvious point. It's taking work that my colleague here at Brookings, Lawrence Chandy, has done, and Lawrence and his team have done essentially a baseline projection for poverty reduction through to 2030, and it takes us from where we are now, plugs in the growth projections through to 2030. And the baseline is essentially a continuation of existing wealth distribution patterns across countries. And the two scenarios that you see on either side of that set out what happens with distributional shifts in one direction or the other. So the declining inequality scenario is based on a small distributional shift from the richest 10% to the poorest 40%. The worsening inequality scenario is the inverse of that. And what you can see is that by 2025, the gap between the declining inequality scenario and the worsening inequality scenario is equivalent to something like 430 million people. There is a difference between 430 million people more or less in poverty. So these things matter. You'll notice at the end of the projection, if we do nothing and we just assume a simple continuation, we're going to get down to around 5% poverty by 2030. Jim Kim at the bank has set what he calls an ambitious goal of 3% by 2030. I'm not sure what exactly is ambitious about following a business usual trajectory that will get us to where we would have been anyway. But I would have thought you'd an issue to take up in that dialogue. Can we go to the next slide? Actually, skip the next slide and go to the one after. This is basically, I just wanted to drill down into some of the data points here. What we've done for Nigeria and Zambia, and we have it for a few other countries, is that we've looked across 2 survey periods at what has happened to the distribution of growth and the interface with poverty reduction in a group of resource-rich countries in Africa. These are relatively high growth countries, especially in Zambia in the period in question. Nigeria slightly less so. But what's really striking about the growth process is you can see from this that in Zambia, the bottom 7 deciles have all seen a drop in their share of national income during the growth process. Most of the increment to growth has been captured by the top 20%, and in particular by the top 10%. It's the same story in Nigeria. And if you go to the next slide, what this feeds into, we basically did the same exercise that we did globally for these countries. So we asked the question, how much should poverty have fallen by, given the pattern of income distribution at the start of the growth process, and how much did it actually fall by? And you can see in the case of Zambia that rather than falling, poverty actually increased by about 660,000. In the case of Ghana and Tanzania, poverty fell, but it fell by much less than would have been expected. So I just wanted to get the point across with this data that, if you will, the end of the eradication of absolute poverty, you ignore the distributional side of the equation at your peril, because you won't achieve the goals. That's the basic message here. If we could go to the next slide. Sorry, next one. Actually, go, Claire. How am I doing for time?
About another minute or two.
Okay. Could you just go to the next one? I'm gonna slip this. I just wanted to actually just hold it there for a moment. Don't click the next button yet. I mentioned in education that we've seen a dramatic slowing down in progress since 2005. And that slowdown, which I don't have time to go into now, but if you look on a country by country basis, the types of groups that are not being reached in terms of getting into the education system are child labourers, girls who are dropping out because of early marriage, poor rural girls in most countries in particular, ethnic minorities, children with disability and vision impairment, and so on. But one of the things that we tried to do in UNESCO was to capture the way that these different types of disparities intersect and interlock with each other. And if you click the next button, please. So this basically lines up a bunch of countries in terms of the average years in education attained by young people in the age 15 to 17. And in Nigeria, I'm sorry, the age group is wrong, it's 17 to 22. But in Nigeria, it's just under 7 years. But when you start breaking that down, and could you go to the next slide? So if you break it down by rich and poor, you see that you've immediately, being born into a poor household deprives you of your entitlement to 6 years of education relative to a rich household. And the next slide. And if you break it down again by rural and urban, the gap for the rural poor is much wider than it is at the top end of the distribution. So there's something that's going on in the interface between poverty and living in a rural area. And the next slide. And this is introducing the gender dimension into it. So you can see, again, the rural the years in education is 2.6, which is around 4 years less than for boys. And the final click. And this is for poor rural Hausa girls in northern Nigeria. I mean, this is an area where there's very high levels of child marriage in particular. So, you know, you can see across these 3 dimensions there's something that's going on. You know, these aren't separate and isolated disadvantages. They're interlocking and mutually reinforcing. And the last slide. Yeah, and this is basically just to show you some data we pulled out yesterday, which is comparing changes in child mortality between rich and poor in a selected group of countries. But you can see in the Philippines, just to take one of the outliers, that the reduction is around it's early in the morning, 5 times higher among the rich than it is among the poor. And I think this highlights, again, the really critical importance of getting governments to focus on these underlying disadvantages. I'll actually leave it there, Claire, but I think the underlying message that I want to get across in all of this is that we really need to end this implicit separation of the idea that you can have bold and ambitious absolute goals and weak and timid relative goals that ignore the critical importance of distribution.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And we can come back to some of the things that I see in your subsequent slides in the discussion, I hope. That was great framing. We're now going to go into the next 2 presentations, which are more on the sort of detail of how some of these issues that Kevin has raised so clearly could actually be tackled through a post-2015 agreement. So first, let me ask Marion to talk about some of the recent work that Sightsavers have been doing.